afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming out on this getting to be chilly fall afternoon. On behalf of my colleague to my left, Professor Henrik Schatzinger, and myself, Brian Smith, as co-directors of the Center for Politics and the People, we'd like to invite you or welcome you to this event. We thought last week after the elections it would be a good opportunity to wait a few days and then maybe have an opportunity for the campus and for the community to gather to reflect on what happened during the elections. It was a very divisive moment, it was a very emotional moment, and so it's time maybe for some reflection about what happened and where do we go from here. Some of the questions that the panelists have developed that they'll use to frame their conversations are the following. Why do you think Donald Trump won the presidential elections and Hillary Clinton lost? What happened in this election cycle that was different from previous elections? What's the most important learning experience we as a nation should take from this? Were the polling data before the election accurate in predicting the outcomes? What now will be the impact on our party system, the future for the Democratic Party, the future for the Republican Party? Have we, in this week since the election, seen some attempts by our leaders to come together and to work together for the future? These are some of the questions that are going to emerge in the conversation among the panelists for about 45 minutes. Our panelists are a mixture of faculty and students. In the middle is our moderator, Dean Ed Wingenbach, who is our vice president and dean of our faculty. At both ends, we have professors Henrik Schatzinger and Meg Karn of the Politics and Government Department. And seated next to our moderator, we have Rose Hogmeyer and Christian Ryan, who respectively are leaders of the College Democrats and the College Republicans. So we will now have about 45 minutes, led by our moderator, Dean Wingenbach.
Thank you, Brian. All right, so before we jump right into this, I want to take one of those questions a little bit off the table because I don't think it's a really interesting one for this conversation, which is the one about polling accuracy. And I want to say two things about that. First, political science, I've heard people say, well, political science is in trouble now, right? Which is exactly what they said in 2000. Political scientists have models for elections. We publish them every year in an American Political Science journal called PS. There are 8 or 9 models that predict the elections based not on the candidates and not on the campaigns, but based on economic models, popularity of the incumbents, conflict in the parties, things like that. The aggregate of those models predicted a 2.2 point victory for the incumbent party. Right now, and that's the popular vote because we can't really predict the state level. There's too much noise there. Right now, the incumbent party received 0.7, and by the time the 5 million or so outstanding votes, mostly in California, are counted, it'll be close to 2%. Right? So the political scientists nailed it. Exactly like we did in 2000, where predicted the popular vote and the Electoral College didn't translate it the same way. Right? So political science is okay. If you're not looking at campaigns. In terms of polls, if you look at the sort of aggregates of national polls, again, of the popular vote rather than the state level votes, what you see is pretty good forecasting. So in the 538 final polls, we're projecting 48.5% of the vote for Hillary Clinton. Right now, she's at 47.8. Right? That's a pretty much exact prediction. At 44.9 for Trump, he's at about 47.2 or 3 as the vote totals come in. That's well within the margin of error, right? That's about what you can expect from polls. The last thing I'd say about this sort of polling thing, I think where there's lots of confusion, is that people are not very good at thinking about probability. Right? I heard from a lot of people on Tuesday evening, Wednesday, and Thursday. I was looking at Nate Silver, and he said there was only a 29% chance that Donald Trump would win. What would happen? How did this happen? Right? And that was 29%. That's like, if the weather forecast says there's a 29% of rain, I send my kids to school with an umbrella. Right? That's not that unlikely. Or as somebody from Cleveland, I can tell you that when your team is winning the World Series 3-1, you have an 85% chance of winning. And when you don't blame the statisticians, right? You say, well, that was a really amazing thing that happened. It hadn't happened in 30-some years, and god damn it, that sucked for me, right? So the polling itself was pretty good if you expect out of polls and probability what polls and probability can give you, right? Which is ranges and what you can and can't expect. If you expect it to be accurate and tell you for sure what's going to happen, you can't do that. All right, so that's off the table as far as I'm concerned. Maybe not, but that'll be up to the audience. So the first question I want to ask for our panelists, and I will ask this question, let them think for a moment, and give a couple of bits of data that I think help understand this question, which is this: what were the one or two most significant changes that explain the 2016 outcome? Right? So changes from 2012 to 2016, or changes in the way the campaigns were, or changes in the electorate, right? So what happened to make 2016 different? And let me give you two bits of information from the exit polls that I think help, from my point of view, to explain what was different. The first is to look at race, right? If you look at the white share of the vote, in 2012, 59% of whites voted for Mitt Romney, and 58% voted for Trump. 39% of whites voted for Obama, 37% of whites voted for Hillary Clinton. There was very little change, a 1% change towards Trump in the white vote. If you look at the African American vote, 95% of African Americans voted for Obama, and 88% voted for Trump. That was a 7% shift towards Trump. And if you look at Latinos, you saw an 8% shift from Romney to Trump, right? African Americans and Latinos made up 23% approximately of the electorate, and that portion of the electorate shifted about 7.5% towards Trump, right? So that's one big factor. The Obama coalition didn't appear, right? The other big number I would give you is by age. The 18 to 29 cohort, in 2012, 37% of people 18 to 29 voted for Romney, and 60% of people 18 to 29 voted for Obama. In 2016, 37% of people 18 to 29 voted for Trump. Exactly the same number, but only 55% voted for Hillary Clinton. Right? That kind of, for me, those are the sort of the two big figures that explain the change in the demographics of the vote. Right? What do the rest of you think? What are some of your big lessons or changes that happened?
So one of the biggest changes for me in this election would be the seriousness of the third-party candidate. I haven't been alive for a third-party candidate like Gary Johnson to be actually so serious about running and really holding it out to the end. And certainly I haven't seen a lot of young people be really excited about a third-party candidate like this before. I know back home in Minnesota, which is such a blue state, so traditionally Democratic, a lot of my friends, a lot of my personal friends, wanted to vote third party in this election because a lot of young people, I think, really weren't quite sure how trustworthy or how viable our major party candidates were. I don't know how viable the third party candidate was, Gary Johnson, but I think it says a lot about where third parties may go in the future for elections. I think gender is also something I'm still trying to wrap my head around. Well, I know what gender is, but I'm trying to think about why so many women who look like me, maybe a little bit older than I am, and certainly working class, why they voted for Hillary Clinton. I'm sure you probably know better than I do the percentage of how many women voted for Trump over Clinton, but that really surprised me and really shocked me that maybe we weren't reaching that audience, at least for the Democratic Party, as well as we could have or as well as we should have.
I'll just answer Rose's question because I think that's something that stood out for me is not what changed but what stayed basically the same, is that Clinton won the women's vote by 1 point better than Obama, right? She got 54% as opposed to his 53, which I think was not a change, but a surprising stasis.
kind of a separate issue, but something that I noticed really dramatically working through this election, working with specifically the Republican Party of Wisconsin, is the amount of grassroots efforts by the Republican Party to get out there. In the past, it's always been a national effort, and same with the Democrats this year, as it has been for a long time. There's a top-down approach, and Hillary Clinton, I have to commend her. She ran one of the most efficient get-out-the-vote machines since Tammany Hall. But there was a different trend when it came to the Republicans. With the Republicans this year, it was a lot more focus on grassroots effort, mostly because the Trump campaign didn't put out anything. It was really hard for us, even in the beginning, to get Trump material. We didn't have Trump flyers, we didn't have Trump yard signs, we had nothing like that, because the Trump campaign is not at all a traditional campaign and did not cooperate very well with the RNC at the beginning. So it was a lot more based on the states, based on the Republican parties at the state levels and the Republican Party at the national level, not so much pushing for Trump, but pushing for different candidates, especially here in Wisconsin. I think Ron Johnson kind of proved the changing dynamic of how the party system for the Republicans works. Is he didn't depend as much as he has in the past on the national party, but he relied on the county offices and on regional offices to really get stuff going on his own, and I think he did a tremendous job.
What stands out to me is the amount of anger in the American public. If we're looking at the degree to which also the candidates themselves have used over-the-top rhetoric, but what I want to say is that I think the level of anti-establishment sentiment runs really high in both parties, not just the Republican Party, it's also the Democratic Party. And that means the last thing Americans want is a continuation of previous political dynasties. That's, I think, the last thing Americans want, and I think we have seen some of the results. And so, in other words, what I'm saying is that in that kind of political atmosphere, the worst candidate that you can actually run would be someone like Hillary Clinton. I will also say that I think what also stands out to me is sort of how divided the country is overall. There is a lot of cultural and economic anxiety in society, and I think that's something that Trump used to his advantage, and he addressed the concerns that other citizens didn't feel like were addressed. So these were just, I mean, of course there are many other things that kind of stand out to me. I think Megan mentions the persistence of party identification. Interestingly enough, we also had a survey here on campus of how students would vote, and it turns out that at earlier stages among students, among the public, many citizens weren't quite sure whether they would vote for Trump at the end. At the end of the day, 90% of self-identified Republicans voted with their party's nominee. In other words, they came around. And that's something that's very interesting in American politics, the persistence of party identification. Now let me just, now we're kind of throwing out some numbers here, but I read an article where it talked about the turnout or the voting behavior in Michigan, where what was interesting is that, roughly speaking, or so 90,000 people in Michigan who are Democrats, they voted Democrat straight down ballot, but they left the presidential ticket blank. They just couldn't bring themselves to vote for Clinton. And that's something that Clinton needs to come to, or the party needs to come to grips with, and how is that possible? Democrats weren't willing to kind of vote for Clinton.
One other change that I think is related to that shift at the state level, that's an interesting one going back to the data, is even though the white vote overall for Romney and for Trump looks very similar, the distribution of that vote changed dramatically. So if you look at college-educated white voters and white voters without a college education, those are about the same size, 37% of one, 34% of the other. And what you saw in this election was a 10% shift towards Clinton among college-educated white voters, right? Which means voters who are concentrated in states that Democrats are already tend to do well in. And you saw a 14% shift among whites without a college education towards Trump, right? So even though the overall vote of the white population, which is 70% of the voters, the same numbers voted for Trump as voted for Romney, who they were changed pretty dramatically. And that change meant you saw a lot more white votes for Trump in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, and a lot more white voters for Hillary Clinton in places like New York and California and Washington and Oregon and Chicago, right? And what that means in terms of the electoral outcome, the big change is you had much larger numbers of wasted votes for Hillary Clinton, right? If she wins California by 68%, like she's going to, rather than 65%, it makes no difference, right? Whereas if you get 50,000 more votes in Wisconsin, you win the state. And that's, for me, the other big change, is that not the difference, you know, the white vote stayed the same, but it changed dramatically in the character of that vote. All right, anybody else want to, what else, any other things about the changes and differences?
I was just going to say, another change that I was going to say is I was thinking about it a little bit differently, but in terms of the urban-rural divide, right? That was much more starkly in the Republicans' favor in this election than it was in 2012. And we're seeing sort of the increasing concentration, as you said, Democratic voters in not only the coast, but in very particular urban areas, right? If you looked at the middle part of the country, it looked like sort of a sea of red with little like blueberries sprinkled in it, right? Those are the urban centers, right? The Milwaukees, the Madisons, the Atlantas, what have you. So that, I think, is a big change from 2012, certainly.
So, Henrik, you mentioned the anger driving some of these changes. I wonder what you and others in the panel think pushed this sort of dramatically different electorate, dramatically different in certain very specific ways, but still, it's a big change. What do you think explains those changes?
Let me just start, of course, you could write books and books about this, I guess, but I'll just maybe start with a few observations. You look at the Democratic race, and you look at how the primaries were conducted, and I think many Democrats on that side saw, there is the DNC, the leadership of the party. They're basically supporting Clinton and pulling different stunts in terms of feeding questions and having debate nights and Saturday nights where the audiences are small, and and very other things that came out also via WikiLeaks. And I think this is just one little piece of the puzzle, and it confirms people's perception that the system is rigged. The phrase itself can mean many different things for different people, but I think it's just an element of that process. I think a lot of disappointment on the Republican side means that Republicans have been trying to elect people into office who would change Washington, change it in a way that the federal debt is being tackled and then looked seriously, and budget deficits, and they often don't see that kind of change. And they kind of see, even our people maybe go into the lucrative lobbying careers and are part of Wall Street. And of course, Clinton herself gives speeches to Goldman Sachs and Bank of America, makes millions of dollars, and she's part of the system. And I feel like there's so much of these little pieces that in people's mind, basically confirms a puzzle that, where are we? Where's the little guy kind of represented in the system? Let's show it to them a little bit.
I think a lot of the anger comes from also the primaries. So it didn't help that Hillary Clinton was running against Bernie Sanders, who was very favorable amongst the establishment voters. Someone who looked pure, right next to, in comparison to Hillary Clinton. And I think a lot of the anxiety and a lot of the anger is also driven out of the fact that Republicans had 17 candidates at one point. That is an outstanding number. So sort of the race to really narrow down who is going to be your candidate, or who is going to,
perspective of someone who's been working with the Republican Party for a while, yes, Donald Trump was very out there in a lot of the stuff he said. And not all of it is something that's good. We can all agree on that. Donald Trump has gone too far in some things. I'll be the first one to say that. It's interesting, though, to look where a lot of the hate is coming from, where fear is coming from, on both sides of the divide. A lot of it is focusing on racial, ethnic differences, linguistic differences, religious differences. It's hard for Americans to really face up and say, we are different, but we'll get along. We're different with some ideas that sometimes are never compatible, but yet we'll still try to duke it out in the political sphere, not in the private sphere or on social media, between each other, but through our elected representatives in Congress. So it's hard when you have someone like Donald Trump really promoting a lot of, on one side or the other, that anxious sort of rhetoric. But the other side doesn't help. This entire election was focused on one side or the other of promoting that sort of fear. Are you afraid of Donald Trump? Are you afraid of Hillary Clinton? Which side do you fear the most? And that's the side you should be voting against. Is that really what we want to focus on? Is that really how we create a nation that after this election can come together and focus on what's good for everyone and not just good for one minority or one majority or one demographic? We're a country. We're not a set of minorities that have to grapple with each other and duke it out whenever there's election.
So one thing I think relates to that is this conflict, identity-based, class-based conflicts is not unique to the United States, right? We're seeing that across the globe in increasing numbers. And one of the things I think we're seeing, this desire in modern democracies or developed democracies to find outsiders, people who can solve problems outside of the insiders' formulas, is kind of driven by a reaction to an economy that makes people feel helpless, right? And particularly one that stratifies winners and losers. And you see that in some of this rural-urban issue, right? That what's happened in the American economy and developed economies around the world is a sort of radical meritocracy, right? In the sense of people who have talents and skills and advantages that are valued by a certain kind of marketplace tend to be rewarded, and they tend to then congregate with other people who have been similarly rewarded, and then they all build more capital together, right? And so you see people, say, in places like Wisconsin, right? People who have the kinds of talents that the modern global economy values, they go to college, they do well, they get a job, and they go to a city where they do well, right? And the people who don't have that relatively narrow range of skills that are valued in the global economy, and that's particularly people who, who used to be able to just sort of have a job that, you can, people I went to high school with, some of us went to college, some people get jobs as electricians, some people got jobs at the local factory, some people worked in a farm from a small town in Ohio. Those aren't a career path, right? You're not really a success if you do that. And who gets to be successful is smaller and smaller. At least that's the way culturally it gets defined and economically it's defined. And that's driving anger around the world, right? You see that in England, you see that coming up in France, you see that, or we'll see that increasingly in Germany and other places. So I think there's global issues here that we're seeing in our economy. So, all right, let me move on, keep moving here. What's the one lesson that we should learn from this election?
Sure, I think to ensure that the candidate that you want the most to be the nominee and then to be elected president, I think the biggest lesson we can learn out of this is that it's not enough to just vote. While I'm really supportive of the protests that are going on across college campuses in America right now, I can't help but think, where were you when we needed people to phone bank? Where were you when we needed people to canvass? It's really, for the Democratic Party or for young liberals, it really isn't enough anymore to just guarantee that you'll vote. You need to make sure that you are making sure your friends are voting, they have plans to vote, that that's the biggest lesson I think for young people, especially for elections.
Maybe I'll just follow up on this. So to kind of summarize your point, right? Elections matter and have direct consequences. And in this case, long-term consequences if you're looking at the composition of the U.S. Supreme Court and how it will be probably, reshaping in the coming years. Now, I'll just kind of build on what, Ed just was kind of referring to in terms of the changing economic and workplace environment, right? I think I was reading an article in the Washington Post, basically the inside story of the campaign, where you have quotes and quotes and quotes chronologically ordered by event from the people who are inside the campaigns. It's very fascinating to read the whole story, so to speak. And one thing that stuck with me, if you look at what was discussed in the inner circles of the Clinton campaign, they were discussing how do we attack Trump, what hasn't been thrown at him that we can throw at him, what is, how can we use today's whatever mini scandal to our advantage. And guess what wasn't discussed? It wasn't discussed how do we address the economic and cultural anxieties in our society. How do we address those people who have jobs, who have changed jobs, but who are worried about keeping those jobs, who are worried about the rising cost of healthcare, who are worried about rising costs of education and sending their kids to college. How do we get these people interested in our campaign, and what is our message to them? What is our message to rural America? If we're looking at, again, we talked about numbers at the beginning quite a bit. Rural voters broke 62% for Trump, 34% for Clinton, a 28% gap. That is the same gap that we actually also saw among white, non-college educated women. 62% for Trump, 34% for Clinton. The same gap, interestingly enough. But my, lesson here is that you gotta take the concerns of people seriously and not just look at who's our opponent and attack. You gotta have a clear plan and ideas.
I have to completely agree. I think that really the one thing both parties have to learn and that the American people have to learn is a respect for the little man. There's a lot of Americans who feel left out by President Obama's policies. There's a lot of Americans who feel left out by the policies Hillary Clinton didn't focus on this election, especially economic policy. The front page of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel this morning had an article on Obamacare rates, applying to how people who had voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012 this year voted for Mr. Trump. It was amazing to see the difference in people specifically who had applied and gotten benefits from Obamacare, how they voted, how they changed their vote overwhelmingly towards Trump. I think it's a small issue for Wisconsin specifically to look at, but it's telling for a lot of big problems. And you can look in the state too. Where did President-elect Trump pick up the most votes? Which counties switched over? Now, you look at the wild counties around Milwaukee, the suburban mainstay of the Republican Party that's been there for the last 20, 25 years. That's been where Republicans get their most votes from. A lot of middle class, upper middle class voters who tend to go Republican. This year, there was less Republicans there, but there was more out west. Tripolo County, Pepin County, I can think of everything essentially between La Crosse and Eau Claire went for Donald Trump, when in the past it's been the mainstay of the Democrats in the state. So you can look at the people there and say, okay, what's going on? In Pepin County, small trade, what's going on in Trempealeau, agriculture. So it's the people, as much as anything else, and it's the small man. You can look at the rise of Trump in Hispanic voters. Almost 30% of Hispanic voters went to Trump. I think it has a lot to do with the same issue. People who know that industry in America, that agriculture in America is or will be under attack for a long time to come. They want to focus on the economic issues. They want to focus on issues that give them, to speak bluntly, more benefits, especially Obamacare.
So let me jump in on this a little bit, because I heard two answers about how do we strategize policy messages to reach different candidates or different populations, and I just want to want to be a little bit of a political scientist fundamentalist about this. Most voters don't know anything about policy, right? Most voters don't care about policy, and most people don't follow politics close enough to know anything about policy. People talk about policy as a placeholder for their already established partisan beliefs, right? And whatever policy you hear about that your side has tends to be the policy that people say that they favor. We talk about, in this kind of environment, we talk about policies as mattering a whole lot, and they just generally don't matter very much. What matters primarily is, are people feeling secure, and are they feeling like their lives are improving? Right? And we have an economy that globally is more and more precarious. Even people who have jobs can't count on that job staying there. Even people who have jobs don't have benefits. Right? People who have to work, who have consistent jobs sometimes don't have control over their hours. Right? One of the best predictors of happiness and the sense of security for people is how protected are you from the vagaries of the market. Right? How predictable is your work and is your life on a day-to-day basis? And very few people's lives are predictable and secure that way anymore in the modern world, which means that people get mad and they switch votes. And I think what you're going to see, I think if it had been the other way around, if Romney had won in 2012 and everything else was exactly the same during this election, the Democrat would have won because people don't feel safe and secure. And I think that in 2020, unless there's some dramatic change in the way social policy helps provide security to Americans, in particular working class Americans and middle class Americans, whoever's running against Trump is going to win, right? And that's, if Trump wants to get reelected, and I think you kind of see some of that. He's moving towards keeping most of Obamacare potentially, and doing infrastructure and doing, that's his path to victory. Because no candidate who doesn't protect people's livelihood is going to be able to get reelected, given the way the modern economy works. I don't think. Okay, let's go to that question. What does election mean for the future of each party? Because I just started that as well. For the future of the party you want to talk about. What do you think?
Can I say what I learned from this election?
Sure.
Okay. Actually, I think I'd like to just comment on your point, which is I think we learned something we already knew, which is it's real tough for any party to string 3 presidential victories together. It's real tough. And I remember, I was hearkening back to 2008, President Bush leaving, extremely low popularity. I was telling people the Democrats could run this folding chair and they'd win that election, right? And sure enough, it was also called like a change election, right? So you had 2 candidates, one of whom was sort of the embodiment of change, and one of whom was definitely not. And it's not surprising then that the Democrat and sort of the candidate that embodied change won. In this case, and this echoes Professor Schatzinger's point, I think too, it was a little less changey, but I think some of the angst is driving that, right? We want something different, and what we have isn't working. It reminds me a little bit of somebody who's on drug treatment, right? And it's not working, and yeah, then I will try this experimental treatment that comes with nausea and vomiting, and Putin takes over your government. That's fine, because what we're doing is, what I'm taking now isn't working. Right? So I think we sort of relearned that lesson.
So what's the future of the Democrats and or Republicans here? Just buzz through this one so we can get the audience if people are antsy to take some questions.
Sure, for the Democratic Party, I think we have a lot of cleansing to do, especially with a lot of the conflict and a lot of the drama that was happening throughout the primaries and throughout the major election. A lot of issues like Donna Brazile saying she has a clear conscience for leaking questions. And I think things like that, arise a lot of issues within the establishment of the Democratic Party. While I'm very supportive of Hillary Clinton, I think that we need a lot of changes, starting with who's leading the Democratic Party, who's leading the DNC, hopefully Keith Ellison. But I think we're going to have to see a lot more shifts in the Democratic Party towards a platform similar to Bernie Sanders, as much as that hurts me to say, for us to still have a lot of traction in the future.
Yeah, I will say that, and you know, you may not like to hear it, or some of you may not like to hear it, but I feel like part of the legacy that Trump is leaving behind is he's leaving behind kind of a vacuum of leadership in his own party. And part of it is a result of pretty big campaign or election losses in 2010 and subsequent elections where you know, Democrats have lost seats in Congress, many seats in state legislatures, governorships, and so forth. So now there is kind of a vacuum. And to be honest, I agree with you. I think the direction will be in a somewhat more populist, if you will, direction where you have to have a somewhat more enthusiastic voter base. One thing, you can do many things right in election campaigns, and Clinton surely has made some mistakes, and you know, she went to Texas and Arizona, and instead of looking at other states like Wisconsin and visiting maybe, you know, a state like this. But you know, overall, I think the, you know, direction will be more in the Bernie Sanders direction overall. I will just maybe mention the one or two other things that since they came up. One was, you know, policy details. It's true. I mean, Americans do not care about all so much about the policy details, and the media covers the horse race and all kinds of other things, not so political. But I think people have a pretty good sense of, you know, who is fighting for me in this, who is going to fight once in office. And I think Trump did a good job of painting at least Clinton as someone who is very closely tied to the elites, political elites, corporate elites, and he's actually the one, you know, self-financed and other aspects who will take on some of the special interests. But, you know, I agree with your assessment.
Well, I think first, if I could say some stuff on policy. Growing up where I did, I grew up in a small farming town, Raymond, Wisconsin, in the middle of nowhere, and a lot of what people are saying about the white, non-college educated voter. A lot of males, I guess, equal amount, whatever. But really, we focused on policy all the time. Every time the Farm Bill came out, you better believe we read it. Everyone has their own issues to focus on. Veterans always look at VA policy. Farmers always look at farming policy. The medical profession always look at what's going on in their field, especially with something like Obamacare. I think it's wrong to dismiss people saying, you know, they don't care about policy. Maybe they don't care as much as they should, and maybe they don't read the whole thing or have all the knowledge. But like the professor said, I think they have a good idea of who's fighting for them. Now, the future of the Republican Party now, the next 4 years, is a mandate. The Republican Party has a job to do. If they don't get that done, and if they don't get it done the way they're saying they're going to, I hope each and every one of us holds them accountable for that. They have a job. They've been voted in by the people through all the federal government and many of the state legislatures as well. If they don't fulfill that promise, or if one particular office holder doesn't hold his promises, specifically Donald Trump, I think there's going to be a lot of reckoning to do. We have a job to do. Let's do it.
So I think there's some truth to that in the broader scale of people are going to hold the Republican Party accountable for how they feel 2 years and 4 years from now, because they've got nowhere to run, right? The Republicans own everything, and 35 states as well. So they've got no excuse. I'm not so sure about them doing what they said they were going to do, because it's not clear what they said they were going to do, right? You know, and if you look at Trump's closest advisors, he has between Steve Bannon, Mike Pence, you know, Peter Thiel. You've got all these people who kind of in public have attacked as fundamentally the problem each of the others, right? And you look at sort of the priority, and I'm telling you, Christian about this beforehand. You know, I remember this late September interview with Paul Ryan, where the interviewer said, you know, Donald Trump, your candidate, has proposed a $550 billion infrastructure bill, right? Which, by the way, Donald Trump is the one thing he talked about in some depth in his acceptance speech, and has brought up again. It's clearly a priority for him. When the interviewer asked Paul Ryan about this, he literally laughed out loud and slapped the arm of his chair and said, "That's not one of our priorities," right? So I'm not really sure what the Republicans are going to have to build a mandate out of this. They're going to be able to tell a story about what they do, and it's going to have to be effective. But the idea that there's some kind of actual substantive mandate for what the Republicans can do or should do, right? That's, I think, clearly not the case. there's so many different messages appealing to so many different people here, that the message is primarily help us, right? Things are not good, fix it, right? And what that does is give the Republicans a whole lot of latitude to try a lot of their policy ideas and to see whether they work or not, right? And there's an interesting question whether when the Republicans try it, whether it's looking like Wisconsin, which has done fairly well, or whether it looks like Kansas, which is a basket case, right? So that'll be interesting in the future. All right, we should probably, we have a mic here if we want to ask questions. So I'm going to ask one last quick question to the panel here. If you have a question to ask of the panel, go on and start lining up there. Real quickly, what do you think are the prospects for bipartisanship moving forward here? The prospects for bipartisanship. Are we going to see some bipartisanship, some agreement, or are we just going to see more nastiness and fighting, or something in between? What do you think?
I think you've seen, we might see some bipartisanship to the extent that we've seen Trump sort of moderate some of what he said he's going to do a little bit. And I think on certainly things like an infrastructure bill, you might see some bipartisanship there. I think, another strategy the Democrats might pursue bipartisanship on the hopes of, we're going to let these guys run the show for 4 years, and it's going to go horribly awry, and we're just going to sit back and watch them. That might be one strategy that might wear the face of bipartisanship. But I think there's some room for that. Plus, I think the nature of the Democratic Party is sort of more of a, yeah, well, okay, we can compromise kind of party, as opposed to the Republican Party, which is more of a no, a more black, white, yes, no party. It attracts those kind of voters. It has more of that zeitgeist to it. So I think to the extent that the Democrats pursue the typical, yeah, okay, maybe, kind of zeitgeist, we will see some.
Yeah, I would agree on the issue of infrastructure. I mean, who is against infrastructure, right? I mean, I think...
Paul Ryan.
It's also called pork by another name, right?
Well, at the end of the day, many people, it brings jobs to the districts and so forth. We know that, we'll see. I think clearly there's room for partisanship. But I will also say that I'm not so sure it is actually in the interest of Democrats to really seek out and really force compromise on some issues. If the issue on the table is to build a wall, maybe you want to actually make a case of why you don't want that wall and why it really is not in line with your worldview and how you view politics. So I think there's clearly room to differentiate yourself from the other party, and in some cases that might be the best thing to do.
I want to echo here Professor Karn's point that Democrats might just let Republicans run it and see where that leads them. I think there's going to be a lot of bipartisanship in the House and Senate, or at least a lot of behind-the-scenes bipartisanship, a lot of politicking. So, like, Democrats give a Republican a bill because they want it to pass, that sort of thing. But I think in terms of bipartisanship between Democrats and the presidency, I think it's going to be a harder fight, because I don't think, especially now, Democrats are going to want to be anywhere near the Trump presidency, especially with the chief strategist being announced that it's the head of Ripon. I don't think Republicans are going to want, Democrats are going to want anything to do, at least bipartisanship, with the Trump presidency. But I do have a lot of hope for bipartisanship in the House and the Senate.
I think I have to agree. We all have high hopes for bipartisanship, and I think hopefully that comes out. I don't see any major obstacles to it. I know looking at the makeup, especially the House, there is a good deal of bipartisanship going on now, and hopefully that continues. When you're talking about the presidency, I think you're going to see a lot more of a clear divide. Maybe not between the parties, but maybe even more just between Congress and the executive. Do all the House Republicans, do all the Senate Republicans agree with Donald Trump? No. And it's not supposed to be that way. The executive has a job to do, the legislature has a job to do. So they're going to always compete. I think that's a good thing.
So let's move to some of the questions. We've got people lining up. I'm I'm gonna ask people two things here. When you ask a question, let's ask questions rather than speeches. It's our job to give the speeches. And that mic is going right to the video there, so make sure you speak into the mic so everybody can hear what you're asking.
Hi, I'm Harley Mitchell-Lee, Junior. I'm going to be a philosophy minor and a politics major. I'd actually want to reopen a question that you said that you wanted. I don't want to say dismissed, it's bad wording, but you thought really didn't need much talking about. I prefer not watching the news. I've had convictions for a while ago that the news is generally very, very biased, and I honestly can get more information and better quality information about the world from elsewhere. And given the media sources I was looking at, it was overwhelmingly in favor of Trump. So for me anyway, this raises a bit of an interesting question. Does this election mean that the traditional polling by traditional news sources are no longer properly keyed into the general American political thought? I've had a few theories about why this might be. I've narrowed it down to two. Either people don't want to affirm what they truly think to their types of pollsters, and I know in Schatzinger's class the Jesse Ventura effect kept playing on repeat. That people, it was pretty much a very I'm going to vote Hillary, but then once you get into the office, no, I'm going to vote Trump and stick it to the system. Or because the polls are not taking true slices of what consists of American political thought. I know CNN made the rounds online because their big poll saying Hillary was going to win oversampled women by 20%. As political scientists, if you have a bad polling sample, you're going to have a bad poll. Are we seeing this? And are we seeing a shift to maybe alternative media sources as being the next new thing, like when TV replaced radio?
Yeah, thank you, Harley, for your question. And I want to also say something about Harley. He's actually the one who I think among my students and my courses has been the most accurate in kind of predicting what's going to happen, I think. So I've learned some things from Harley along the way. So let me kind of address the polling question. Well, let me just point out, when it comes to battleground state polls, and we've heard that state polls are notoriously difficult really to conduct, right? The average deviation in battleground states from the actual result was 2.7%, which is still within the margin of error. But I have to kind of really make sure that everybody understands how difficult the business is of polling these days. I will mention a couple of factors. One is non-response bias, right? If you call 100 random numbers, you're probably going to get maybe 10, if you're lucky, 15 people who are going to respond. And now you get to filter out, are those 10 people really, presenting the American public? Then you have a lot more early voting. So the type of election process is changing, which makes the polling predictions even more difficult over the stretched out process. And lastly, you have undecided voters. And we had surprisingly, you might say, given the clear difference between the candidates, we've had a number of undecided voters, and we know from exit polls that they broke 3-2 for Trump, which again, there's no way they can predict exactly how they're going to break, and so that makes it notoriously difficult. But I do agree, and I mentioned in one of my some of my classes, that I feel in this election it was much more likely to break in the direction of Trump, because at least there's a justification. But I do feel that some people feel maybe that the polling industry is part of, I want to say, maybe the more elite industry, and I'm just going to wait until election day and tell people how I really feel. And so I do think again, makes it more difficult for pollsters, right, to really see what's going on.
And also, there's another issue here of, what is polling for? Right? And this has been, I think, a real problem in American politics, certainly for 20 or 30 years. Polls are really, I think, about two things. One, ultimately, they're about figuring out after the fact what was happening. Right? So it gives you the exit polling data to figure out, well, how are people thinking about different issues? And then the other thing they're useful for is for insiders and campaigns to figure out where to put their resources, right? This idea that the vast majority of our news coverage, regardless of source, is this obsession with, who's up 2 points, who's down 1 point, who's up 3 points, which has become this polling industry. Right? It's become a way to generate revenue, when if you look at polling across the time, across several months, what you see in every election going back 30 years is a nice even line, right? There's all this variation, all smoothed out, right? It's not very interesting, but it's easy, and it's a way to keep people excited. Who's up by 1 run, who's down by 2 runs, who scored a touchdown. It turns it into this sort of combat sport that that has some terrible consequences for the way we think about politics. Almost as bad as the consequences of the other part of Harley's question, which is this idea that that there's no common media, and there's all kinds of multiple news sources, none of which can be checked, none of which have any authority to say what's true and what's false. And you can't tell now whether something has actually been reported and verified, or whether it was made up by Macedonian teenagers and pushed onto your Facebook page, right? You literally can't tell the difference unless you are a fairly sophisticated consumer of information. Even then, it's a challenge, right? And that's a real problem. I don't know what we do about that, right, in American democracy. But we should go to the next question. We got several people there. Anyone else want to say anything about this?
Just make one very brief observation. That one comes from Daniel Knox, who's in the audience, one of my students, and he pointed out if you look at polling in the States, you actually have fewer news media, newspaper outlets, right? Because of the dying newspaper industry, and those are the ones who traditionally did state-level polling. So nowadays, you actually have more out of desperation, I want to say, organizations who do some polling, but they don't have the experience or expertise sometimes to really do this really well.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that the state level polling errors were sort of a record high for the past couple of decades, but it was still only 3.9% overall. So these are extremely accurate for the most part. It's possible the samples this time overrepresented well-educated voters. Estimating education levels is extremely difficult for pollsters. It's not in the voter file, and it's real hard to tell what kind of education level somebody has based on where they live or what their name is. Race is a piece of cake by comparison. And I do feel compelled to say that prior to this election, we had an N of 0 for female presidential candidates, right, on which to base our model for this election. So we don't know to what extent that mattered or how or whether to include it in our models. So that's I think another factor that would be mentioned.
Let's save the next question.
All right, hey everybody, I'm Willie. I'm a junior here. Just kind of going off of the theme of polling and polling accuracy. I want to focus on polling perception, not necessarily the raw numbers or anything, because I think the results of the election took a lot of us by surprise, myself especially. I was shocked by a lot of the results. I can think back of, I was at a corn roast at the Outagamie County Republican Party this summer, and we were concerned about the Ron Johnson Senate race. The mood was not a happy one, essentially. And even President Massetti wrote an article a couple of weeks ago, and he said, and I quote, "If the polls are even remotely correct, she, Hillary Clinton, will be president and may take with her more Democrats into Congress as well." So I just think that going into the election, there was so much of a perceived notion of who would win, and then the results came out and people were shocked. So going forward for polling companies and the media, what does this mean for their perception? Because to me, it seems as though they've lost quite a bit of credibility. How and when can they get that back, if at all?
I'll take a quick jump at that. I think it's not the polling companies that lost credibility; it's the media, right? And I don't want to submarine my boss on this, but to say things like, well, if the polls are remotely correct, then Hillary will win, is a fundamental misrepresentation of how polling and scientific study of public opinion works, right? Now, it was infelicitously phrased because when you're talking to a public audience, as Zach was in that article, you can't get fine-grained about that. But this is the problem. I ran earlier. One of the many problems in the way that we talk about elections, which is this emphasis and obsession with horse races rather than policy or public opinion as expressed by particular individuals. That is driven not by the fact that polling companies are producing data, but the fact that media is talking about it if it had some meaning, right? Rather than just some sort of snapshot of what things look like today. It's a malpractice. Anybody else want to say anything?
Well, maybe what I would say is just polling organizations should point out the limitations basically that we already identified and clearly make clear that many things are still unclear even when we have those results. And still, many Americans don't understand this idea of what is the margin of error when they see plus minus 4% on TV. So we're trying to educate our students and the population about these things, but it's often mistaken for polling is not a precise science, period, right? And so that message needs to get out there from whoever conducts these polls.
Good afternoon, I'm Ben, I'm a junior here. Given the recent presidential election where Secretary Clinton won the popular vote and Mr. Trump won the electoral vote, thus winning the election, do you feel that the Electoral College is still a justified system to use in American government today?
Yes, I do. I think it's a fundamental part of our republic, and I would think that it needs to change. It's the will of the people. It gets passed through an amendment to the Constitution. That's fine and dandy, but personally and speaking for the party, I don't think it needs to change. Of course, that's very easy for me to say.
I'm also pretty supportive still of the electoral college system. I feel like the way that demographics work, the way that states work, how some states are more traditionally blue and other states are more traditionally red, I think it still makes sense to have an electoral college, which in theory is still representative of the government, or excuse me, representative of the people, to decide in presidential elections. So like the other day in Dr. Colucci's class, we were talking about how Hillary did win the popular vote. While it wasn't by much, she did win the popular vote. I don't think that it's fair considering that a lot of states still, if you're going by the popular vote, and if it was based on still on states, it would be fair to say that because California has more Democrats, therefore they should be able to have that sort of power over the popular vote. I still have faith in the system.
I like the way Nebraska and Maine do it.
Which is what
They do it proportionally. It's not winner take all in those two states. They allocate their electoral votes proportionately.
Proportionately by congressional district. I don't know. To be honest, I kind of go back and forth in terms of how I think about the issue. I can see the benefits right now in allowing citizens from rural states and so forth to hear the candidates and not just population centers around the country at the same time. I mean, we are going to probably look at the end of the day at like a 2 million vote advantage for Clinton, which is also, I feel, unprecedented actually in American history. And so from that perspective, I feel like, a change would be good. Even our new president-elect seems to have, he's not quite sure what he kind of likes. In a recent interview, he said he would prefer a popular vote election. And I will say one thing. Nobody knows exactly how popular vote would have shaken out under different rules, basically, right? I mean, the whole campaign messaging and campaign visits, everything would have been different under these new rules. And so, I mean, it's not, it'd be comforting for some Democrats to hear Clinton won popular vote, but there's no guarantee it would have been a victory for her under the new system.
And ultimately, I think the answer to that question depends on your premise of what democracy and voting is supposed to be doing, right? So the founders set this up because they were concerned about making sure that regional differences were represented. Right? The Constitution doesn't represent people, it represents states and subunits, right? Initially, people didn't even elect the electors. So if you think that what we're supposed to do in a democracy is to let the different regions of the country all have a separate voice, and if that's what democracy is about, then we should be in favor of the Electoral College. If you think that democracy, at least at the presidential level, should be about representing the population rather than the geography, then you'd be against the Electoral College, right? But it's a question of what the premise is that leads to different results. So, next question here.
I'm Gary Wetzel, not a student. There was something on the ballot last Tuesday that I think didn't get nearly the publicity that it should have, and that's marijuana. Maine, Massachusetts, Nevada, and California voted to legalize the possession of marijuana in some fashion. If you add them together with the states that have already done so, about 20% of the U.S. population now lives in a state that legalizes the possession of marijuana in some way. Especially if you assume marijuana is also kind of a code word for drugs in general. What effect is that going to have on the rest of the country and our politics going forward? Are we just going to keep ignoring that this is happening?
Well, first I'd like to point out that, yes, while it is legalized in some states, the federal government still bans marijuana. And I find a very odd sort of hypocrisy in that. If we have a law, enforce it. If we don't have a law, don't pass it, repeal it. Apart from that, personally, I don't support smoking marijuana recreationally. I'm not a medical expert, so I don't know what it does for medicine. But I think that as long as it's banned on the federal level, it should be banned in the states. And this whole deal of states passing it, making it legal is ridiculous.
The contrary to that would be it's a basic principle of federalism, right? The states are the laboratories of democracy, and they're performing an experiment, right? We're going to find out. Whether the federal government decides to go along with this or not, it really is up to them. And it's a Schedule I drug, the same as heroin. And so, you get people who are putting themselves in some amount of jeopardy if they go along with recreational marijuana in California, and the federal government could and might, under the new administration, decide to actually enforce that. You could have people in really serious jeopardy. It'd be very interesting to see what the current government does about that, given, I think that the public opinion structure, as far as we know, on marijuana legalization tends to be pretty liberal, right? So libertarians are in favor of it, Democrats are in favor of it, young people are in favor of it. There's probably a plurality or a majority of people who are either indifferent to or in favor of legalization. So I suspect that it's probably not a political winner for the new Attorney General to start prosecuting people in Colorado and California and Maine for smoking marijuana in their bedrooms or in their dorm rooms. That'd be a good way to get some constituencies that maybe didn't turn out in the last election mobilized. So I wouldn't recommend that the federal government do this if they want to win the next election.
Well, I'm just worried about the authority of law, so to speak, right? If we have state laws that really clearly contradict federal law, I think at some point, there needs to be a clear decision on the federal government to kind of, declare what's going on. The longer they wait, the worse it gets, so to speak, anyways. And I feel like at this point, we already have reached the point of no return in some ways. And so I agree, the public's opinion is probably not in favor of rolling everything back that we have seen so far. So maybe we've already waited too long. But it seems bizarre. I'll agree with that.
Yeah, the toothpaste is on the tube too, to your point, Ed, that young people, if you look at this by age, the younger and younger you get, the more and more favorable until you get overwhelmingly favorable among young people. So we're not getting any less supportive, I think, generationally, and that doesn't bode well for if you want those sorts of things repealed or prosecuted.
Although that could change. That could change once we have big marijuana, right? And it's not cool to smoke pot because you're supporting big marijuana. It was abusive, giving you cancer. Joe the Camel smokes pot, right? So right now it's an artisanal product. It's kind of easy to be in favor of it.
So I guess I'm Rachel Steiner, and I kind of wanted to drop the big bombshell question that we've been kind of dancing around, and that is the new cabinet appointments that Donald Trump has been appointing and that we've been hearing about possibly having white nationalists in our cabinets, people who are openly and in the past been anti-Semitic. So what, on both sides of politics, is your party going to do for minority individuals in America so that they feel safe, that their government officials are not going to be harmful to them, that aren't going to threaten their lives and their livelihoods?
So for Democrats, this is a really important question because this might mean, if this new cabinet isn't doing so well, this might mean 2020 for us. So I think this begins with saying things like, a lot of cities and a lot of states have come out so far as saying that it's okay that we have sanctuary cities, or that we have areas in which we aren't going to unfairly prosecute or unfairly arrest undocumented immigrants. Also, I really appreciate a lot of the movements that are happening on college campuses right now with the college Democrats, where we are buying into movements like the safety pin movements, where we are pushing our college administrators to come out and say these sorts of words. If we are reiterating a lot of vocabulary that people like Ripon or other cabinet members have said about minorities, really pushing them to have a statement about that, and then create infrastructure around it to make sure that minorities are feeling comfortable on college campuses. I think that also means Democrats are holding out for much longer and holding strong in a lot of our values that we've held in this past election, which is that we respect all people. We respect people no matter your sexual orientation, your gender, your sexuality, your race. I think holding true to those values and continuing to be outspoken about it, I think can mean everything for the party, and it can also, give a lot of people who are feeling unsafe at this moment a lot of hope.
I think really the day that Donald Trump starts enacting racist policies, or the day that Rudy Giuliani, if he's going to be Attorney General, starts arresting migrants or people of color in order and numbers just because of their racial background. The day that states start enforcing or arresting people because they might be married to a member of the same sex, that day you have the Republican Party on your side, and that's an abuse of people's rights. But until that happens, until there really is some overstep in federal government, I think it's up to the individuals. And yes, President Trump as an individual, or the Republican Congress as individuals, to be kind to one another, to try to love one another, to treat each other respectfully. But that doesn't mean going out of your way to promote diversity in everything we do. Our country, yes, it's diverse, but we do have a majority of whites in the country. And this country is Western. This country has Western civilization. This country is largely Christian. Those sort of backgrounds and those ideals are going to stay in place for a long time. Nothing's going to change that. So I think you have to focus on who is fearful and why are they fearful. It's sad that people are afraid of President Trump or of any public office holder or anyone in this country. They shouldn't have to be. But how far does it go? Are you afraid because you think Donald Trump is going to be an active racist in office? I'm sorry, that's just not true. Are you afraid that Rudy Giuliani or Chris Christie, if he gets to be in the cabinet, looking less likely, but if it happens, are they going to be sexist in office? No, this is not going to be true. Is everyone biased? Yes. Everyone's biased in their own way. You can't regulate that through some sort of government memorandum or presidential executive order. It's just not going to happen.
So maybe one thing that I think is maybe slightly positive about what's happened in the last election is sort of making much more explicit the way in which race is playing a role in our two parties, is that it's made something, I think, clear that people know or are aware of, but maybe not as focused on if you look at the sort of history of how race works in American politics, right? This is kind of the question I posed back in the spring at the Future of the Republican Party event that I also moderated, where I just asked, like, what Donald Trump is in substance, this is during primaries, sort of posing to the Republican Party was, you've put together conservative policy principles with basically ethnic nationalist appeals, and that's worked really well, and Donald Trump is offering voters one without the other. And it'll be interesting to see which one they choose. And it's helpful, I think, in our politics to see that more clearly. right? Because you think about American history, just a brief, the thumbnail sketch of it, for 200 years we were a slave society, right? And then slavery was abolished, and immediately we created a legal apartheid society. And that lasted 100 years, right? It wasn't until 1965 that we ended legal apartheid, right? It was right before I was born. We were an apartheid state. That was 1965. In 1967, Nixon, the Republican candidate, ran the Southern strategy, right? Which is explicitly about a reaction against the end of apartheid, right? And he won based on the Southern strategy. Ronald Reagan in 1979 opened his campaign, announced his candidacy for presidency with a speech about states' rights, given in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 15 years before, civil rights workers had been tortured and killed, right? And then claimed that it didn't mean anything, right? Well, everybody knew what that meant, right? George Bush ran a different version of that than Lee Atwater talked very specifically, who ran the campaign about explicitly using race to mobilize voters, right? This stuff doesn't change, right? So I don't think people are worried about whether or not there's going to be explicitly racist policy coming out of the Trump administration. I think what's happened is people have become much more able to talk about the ways in which race has always been the dominant factor in American politics on both sides of this, right? And we can't deny it anymore. It used to be polite to not say, well, let's talk about that. We'll pretend not to know what happened in Philadelphia, Mississippi, right? We all agree not to talk about that when it happened. But now we can't. Right? So I think it's a difference between being fearful of policy and being fearful of the implications of kind of letting a genie out of the bottle that you can't put back. And that's where we are right now. So if we want to love each other, we want to get along, we want to be, have empathy for one another, then that, I think, requires having an open discussion about the way in which race works in our politics. And to the extent we're not willing to have that discussion and say, well, we're only talking about race when some crazy person does something specifically to a specific person, the people will continue to be afraid. Right? That's reasonable, it seems to me. One last question?
Can I just answer too? What worries me about this election is that, our children learn the wrong lesson from this election, which is that the end, winning, justifies the means. You can say whatever you want to win an election. And I think we're seeing some of that already in schools, whatever level, elementary school, middle school, high schools around the country. My wife is a school counselor, and when a student hears maybe or is made fun of or harassed and saying that, oh, maybe you'll be deported tomorrow, have a good night. This is not funny to those students who hear that message, right? And it's often really shocking. And so when we look at answers to making minorities safe, you ask the parties, but I think the answer, at least in part or in strong part, has to come from the local level, right? It can be in the administrators in schools, it can be in the churches, it can be from the city governments and councils and so forth, but I think this is where a strong message can be sent up to the federal level.
We're just a minute past 5:30. Professor Smith, should we take one more question or should we wrap it up? One more question, okay. Professor Jeffries?
Hi, my name is Paul Jeffries. I teach in the philosophy department. Everybody's talking about 4 years. As a member of the environmental philosophy, or the environmental studies program, I'm not sure we have 4 years to let us go for what's going to happen, but that's not my question. I have sort of two concerns. One, I think it would be interesting to hear your responses to the influence of the James Comey letter, because I think that was a dramatic time. I mean, I know we've had other events, but at a time sort of Hillary was ascending, that came out and it seemed to kind of affect that, and I think that may have affected a lot of the breaking toward Trump. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And then secondly, I am utterly shocked, I guess, at your optimism about bipartisanship, given the way the Republicans have acted over the last 8 years under the Obama administration. I mean, it's an interesting question of why the Democrats have to always be the adults in the room And the Republicans, I'm sorry, but the Republicans have held out strategies and have broken fundamental norms. And to expect the Democrats to say, oh, yes, we want to work with you, I'd like to see, I want to hear more about that. Because I don't see that is going to be a very helpful or viable strategy. I mean, maybe on infrastructure, yes, I'll give you that one. But I don't see much on anything else. So anyway.
So for bipartisanship, I think I'm hopeful relative to the bipartisanship that won't be happening between Democrats and the presidency. I think it's going to take a lot of, I think it's going to take a lot of work for Democrats and I agree with both Professor Schatzinger and Professor Karn that Democrats' probably best strategy is to really be hands-off maybe a bit, or let Republicans sort of run it. I think there's going to be a lot of bipartisanship that we don't necessarily see on the surface. I think Democrats, I agree with you as a Democrat, that sometimes we are the adult in the room. And I know at least on the state level, speaking with a lot of assembly people who are Democrats, a lot of times to get work done, they have to actually give a bill away. They have to give certain programs or certain ideas or certain initiatives away in order for that to make change. I don't like that reality. I think that's what's going to be happening. But I think I'm not so over the moon that Democrats are going to be working with Republicans in the House and the Senate, but I think I am relative to what very little work is going to be happening between Democrats in the House and the Senate and a Trump presidency.
As far as the James Comey letter goes, I really think that it was yes, it came at an inopportune moment for the Democrats, and yet, of course, it had a political battle on it. Of course, there was something there. But I don't think in the end it had as much of an influence as people gave it. I think it was more of a repeat of things that have been happening the entire electoral cycle. That said, it happened. We won't know what would have happened otherwise, but I don't think in the long run it would have made that much of a difference. As far as bipartisanship goes, I have to agree with Rose a little bit more. Yeah, I'm very hopeful. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. I'm hopeful because I know that, speaking from the position of power in the Congress, the Republicans, if they wanted to, could dictate terms. But if they want to seem civil, especially after the last 8 years, they'll do it smoothly. They'll do it with Democratic help. And the Democrats really, they have an experience base. They have a lot of knowledge about the issues in their constituencies. So hopefully Congress works as Congress and not just Republicans versus Democrats.
Again, just to be very clear, when your values, when your beliefs, when your worldview, when your policy solutions differ greatly from the other party, then I think opposition is something that's very healthy and inevitable. So I'm not suggesting by any stretch that Democrats should, force themselves to work. I think, if anything, that could be that would send the right message to some voters to come out in 4 years. And so I'm not so hell-bent on bipartisanship. But as far as the Comey letter is concerned, well, let's be honest, the margins in the battleground states, they weren't as large, right? So could it make a difference? Yeah, it could have made a difference. But what I'm warning Democrats is to look and say, oh, it was misogyny, it was racism, and it was the Comey letter that kind of explains the election. Let's move on and put it into, the dumpster, so to speak, and I think that's the wrong answer. I think, what Democrats have to ask themselves is, why did millions of people who voted for Obama in 2008, and many of them also in 2012, vote for Trump in 2016? That's the uncomfortable question that they have to put on the table and discuss very clearly.
I will say, with regard to bipartisanship, this election at the congressional level, House and Senate, was a wash for women candidates. We're at about the same place we were, almost exactly the same place we were in 2014 and 2012. And given the empirical evidence that we have that women are actually more likely to work across the aisle than men when in the legislature, that doesn't bode well for bipartisanship.
So on the Comey letter, I'll take the last word on this. On the Comey letter, I think it's largely irrelevant, right? I mean, if you go back and look at the history of every election for which we have good data going back, 5, 7 elections, and you look at the trend line for both candidates, and then you map the polling on it, and you put little events on them like the Comey letter, the debate, and when you find out this thing, and when the Iranian government said that thing in 1980, right? You get all these bounces around, but the line stays the same, right? It's just another thing that made a couple of bounces, and in the end, everything smooths out, right? So there's my social science fundamentalism again, right? These things don't matter very much, right? If it happened the day before the election, maybe that swing managed, but it was long enough out that it just smooths into the noise. On bipartisanship, I'm not, you asked about being optimistic about it. I wouldn't call it optimism to look for bipartisanship here. I think that the lesson of modern politics is if you want to win elections, don't cooperate, right? Why would you? It doesn't pay. Right? If you cooperate, then if you don't make clear distinctions between yourself and the opposition in a two-party democracy, then the voters don't get a choice, right? And if you don't, if your primary concern is to be reelected, right, rather than to look for what's the best interest of the polity, and that's increasingly, certainly where we've been in American politics since at least 2000, right, on both parties, which is what's good for the country is what's good for my party, and the other party is horrible, demonic, terrible people who will ruin the country, right? If you believe that, why would you cooperate, right? Frustrate them, make sure they're a one-term president or a one-term senator so that you, with your good people, can take over and pass good policy. Right? If you believe that, why would you cooperate? Right? And what we see is it tends to work. So I don't expect to see any bipartisanship. And that's just where we are in American politics. It's where we've been for 16 years. Actually, it's where we've been for closer to 25 years. And it's probably where we're going to be for the next 20. So on that joyous note, Bishop Brian, Professor Smith wants to come up and make some announcements here. And while you do that, this is not a Center for Politics and the People announcement, but next Monday, General Michael Flynn, who is has been Donald Trump's leading national security and defense advisor throughout the campaign, is part of the transition team, is very likely to be either the national security advisor, perhaps CIA director, defense secretary, something important, right? He will be here, probably in this room, depending on what the crowds look like, speaking on Monday. It's a really big deal. I'm frankly kind of surprised that he's still coming. Given he has other things to do, but he said this morning that he is coming.
At what time?
So it's at 4 o'clock. So there's posters up about this, and other media announcements about it. But I would encourage those of you who are interested in this event, probably interested in that event. It is, however, not a Center for Politics and the People event. It's the International Relations Club. It's a student-organized event. So this is something really cool about our students that they can give. Probably the first big speech by a potential cabinet member of the Trump administration will happen right here because our students have brought him here.
I want to thank the panelists for a very interesting conversation and giving us much to think about. We want to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving, and there will be one more event that the center will be sponsoring the Monday after Thanksgiving, the 28th. There will be a student panel on gun control and the various dimensions of gun control in our society today. That will occur on November 28th, Monday at 4:15 in Little Theater. Thank you all for coming very much.